Hi, I'm Roland Forgon, and I am an intellectual who likes talking and wants to share my ideas online. And basically, I don't necessarily think that Russell's paradox is a paradox. And I either want mathematicians to roast me in the comments, or to have a real discussion. So, we'll see how it goes. Russell's paradox is a paradox in naive set theory, and to explain it, I'm actually going to play a video by Jeffrey Kaplan. If you haven't seen it, go watch it now, pull it up, put it on mute, just let the ads roll, whatever you need to do to give him proper credit and time.
English philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell discovered a problem, a paradox, at the heart of mathematics and all of science. The paradox specifically concerns a foundational branch of mathematics called set theory. So, in this lecture, I teach you all of set theory in like 8 minutes, and then I show how the paradox arises. Russell himself and many other mathematicians thought that they could solve this paradox, but I argue that they can't, and they don't. So let's get started. What is a number? Take, for example, the number 4. I'm not talking about 4 potatoes, or 4 tomatoes, or 4 hairs. I'm talking about the number 4 itself. We know lots of things about the number 4, like that it is evenly divisible by 2, and that it's the square root of 16, I think. I'm talking about the number itself. And I'm also not talking about this right here. This is not the number 4. This is the Arabic numeral written on a piece of glass. The Arabic numeral that represents the number 4. We have other numerals that represent numbers like this one. That's the Roman numeral 4. We use it for counting Super Bowls here in the United States. The number itself is something that no one has ever seen or touched, but we seem to know things about, and also it, and every other number, is essential to science, technology, and all of human life. Immanuel Kant was a Prussian philosopher, living in the 1700s. This painting of him was actually done in color, but I've changed it to black and white to make it seem even older. He thought that mathematics was a construction of the human mind. And if that's right, then mathematical truths are, in some sense or other, subjective. But the German and English philosophers, Gottlob Frege and Bertrand Russell, didn't like this. They thought that mathematics had to be objective, to refute and counteract.
And I would argue that with my thought, it is still objective. And that naive set theory itself is about observing the logical consequences and dealing with them, rather than trying to define your way out of them. Because once you're strictly defining things rather than observing the logic, you are now in a subjective state of mathematics. You are in the state that you have constructed rather than from a state that just follows from the logic, if that makes sense.
Kant's view, they developed a view called logicism. According to logicism, mathematics is a branch of logic. And the most basic type of math, which is arithmetic, could be reduced to just first-order basic logic and set theory. I'll explain what set theory is in a second. They thought that if they could succeed in reducing arithmetic to logic and set theory, then they would be able to answer this question, what is a number? And the answer would be that numbers are sets. Okay, well, what is a set? A set is a collection of objects. The branch of mathematics that studies sets, or collections of objects, was invented by the Russian-German mathematician Georg Cantor in the 1870s. Cantor proved that some infinities were larger than other infinities. Yes, that's right. The idea is that you could have an infinite number of something, and then an infinite number of something else, but that you'd have more of one than the other. Yes, it's wild. In order to do this, he had to invent set theory. And so now, I'm going to teach you set theory very quickly, but then set theory is going to run into a terrible problem. It's going to seem terrible. They're going to try to solve it, but then I'm going to show that they didn't really solve it. The version of set theory that I'm going to explain to you in the next few minutes is naive set theory. It's called naive just because it's the ordinary set theory that we can formulate in ordinary languages like English, and it's contrasted with formal or axiomatic set theory, which is formulated in an artificial logical language. You don't have to worry about any of that. A set is a collection of objects, like the set of these markers. There are 3 markers here, and the set of these markers contains 3 items within it. But the objects in a set don't need to be collected together in space or time in order to be a set for the purposes of set theory. So on the one hand, we could have the set of those 3 markers, but we could also have the set of all of the people watching this video who are spread out all over the world. Maybe they're spread out throughout time. Moreover, the objects in a set don't need to be related to each other in any significant or meaningful way. Another set could be the set of LeBron James, the 4-time NBA champion, and the top half of the Eiffel Tower. These things have nothing to do with each other, really, but we have a set with those 2 things in them, those 2 members, those 2 items. Anything that we can refer to, anything that we can imagine, that can be in a set. We could have a set that consists of LeBron James, the 4-time NBA champion, and Harry Potter, the young wizarding boy.
And my point, therefore, is if we allow both dynamic and static sets separately, the set of all people who have watched that video is a dynamic set. It changes with time, it changes based on when you define it, and furthermore, when you even think of defining the set, right? And furthermore, A static set of the same idea would be a set of all people that ever have or will watch the video, and that is a set that we do not necessarily know the contents of. And many sets we cannot know the contents of. Right? Okay.
Boy who does not exist. That set contains those two objects, one of which has won an NBA championship 4 times as of the recording of this video, and the other one is a non-existent boy with magic powers. Indeed, sets can even include objects that can't be imagined. We could have the set of all objects that cannot be imagined. That's a set too, and it contains many, many things, perhaps an infinite number of things that can't be imagined. You see these squiggly brackets? The squiggly brackets are used in set theory to pick out the set, and all the stuff inside those brackets are the stuff in the set. So this is the set of LeBron James and the number 4. There are 2 things in this set, a number and a basketball player. On this form of notation, in order to pick out a set in writing, we would have to write out all of the things that are in that set. But that's too clumsy if it's a big set, like the set of all cats. The set of all cats includes many, many things, too many cats to list out. And also, we don't even know all the names of all the cats in the world, all the cats in the universe. So instead we use this notation, which is read as follows. The set of all x's such that x is a cat. That's called the set builder or intentional notation. You don't have to remember that. The other crucial thing is the word contains. We say that a set contains all of the objects that are members of that set. So this set from before contains LeBron James and the number 4. The set of all cats contains Garfield and all the other cats as well. A set is a many that allows itself to be thought of as a one. Georg Cantor never said that. Someone just said that he said that, but he didn't really say it. A set is a gathering together into a whole of definite, distinct objects of our perception or of our thought, which are called elements of the set. He did really say that, but he said it in German. When Cantor invented set theory in the 1870s, he wasn't just making up a mathematical game for the sake of it. No. We deal with sets every day. Suppose that someone says that pile of potatoes is enormous. They're not talking about the individual potatoes. They're not saying the individual potatoes are enormous. Some of them may be quite large, but some of them are small. Like fingerling potatoes. I'm going to try to find a photo of a fingerling potato or some other kinds of potatoes. Anyway, when we say that pile of potatoes is enormous, we're talking about the pile, not the individual potatoes. And we do the same thing with objects that are not collected together spatially. The world's population of cats is enormous. The cats aren't collected together in space, but we're talking about all of the cats as a whole. And we're saying that population is enormous. We're not saying that the individual cats are enormous, although some of them might be quite hefty. The paradox, the logical problem that Russell discovers in 1901 concerns one or more of the rules of set theory. So let's go through some rules real quick before we can get to the paradox. Rule number 1. Unrestricted composition. That just means we can make any sets we want. Any set that you can think of, that's a set. In the formal axiomatized version of set theory, this is called the axiom of unrestricted comprehension. You don't have to remember that. Rule number 2, set identity is determined by membership. What does this mean? It means that what makes a certain set, the set that it is just what's inside of it. It doesn't matter how we label that stuff. It doesn't matter how we label the whole set as a whole. All that matters is what's in the set. In formal axiom...
This is one I think might be too inflexible. So let's run through that again.
It means that what makes a certain set, the set that it is just what's inside of it. It doesn't matter how we label that stuff. It doesn't matter how we label the whole set as a whole.
Now, that being the case, then a dynamic set would actually be if you're following this, would be a series of sets that whenever it changes, becomes a different set. And it may eventually be the same set it once was, but not necessarily. So, if you are strictly defining a set only by its composition and not by how you label it and by when, you can do that, but you have to understand the when of logically you defined it does inherently affect its composition. And some dynamic sets have, their composition is can't be static. So some sets can only be defined dynamically.
Well, all that matters is what's in the set. In formal axiomatized set theory, this is called the axiom of extensionality. You do not have to remember that. Rule number 3, the order of elements in a set doesn't matter. Here, for example, are 2 sets, the set of the number 1 and the number 2, and the set of the number 2 and the number 1. These 2 sets are the same set, because the order that you put the items in, the objects, it doesn't matter. Now you can see this rule, this really comes from number 2. Number 2 says that set identity is determined by membership. All that matters is who's a member, or what items are a member of the set. It doesn't matter the order. Rule number 4, repeats don't change anything. This set right here, which contains the number 1, the number 2, and the number 2, is exactly the same set that we were talking about 5 seconds ago. It's the set of just the numbers 1 and 2. If you repeat a number or a member of a set, it doesn't change the set because set identity is determined by membership. That's rule number 4, which is really just derived from rule number 2. Rule number 5, the description of the items in a set doesn't matter. For example, the set that contains just LeBron James, and the set that contains all X's, all things, such that that thing is the NBA all-time scoring leader, playoffs included. I'm including the playoffs. If you only talk about the regular season, then Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, as of this recording, is still the all-time points leader. later. But if you include regular season and playoffs, then it's already LeBron James. Those two sets are the same set. It doesn't matter if you describe him as LeBron James or King James or the NBA all-time scoring leader. Either way, it's the same set containing the same one item in it, and that's that guy who's a basketball player. Rule number 6, the union of any two or more sets is itself a set. This rule just means that if you take two sets, like the set of all cats and the set of all dogs, and you combine them, and then you've got the set of all cats and dogs, well, that's a set too. This rule, number 6, comes from rule number 1, because rule number 1 says you can just make any sets you want. So if you got two sets, and then you put them together, that's another set, you can make that one too. Rule 7, any subset is a set. A subset is just a set containing some of the items that are contained in another set, and that comes from rule 1 too. If you can make any set, then any set you've got, well, any group of those items in there, that's a subset, that's a set too. Rule 8, a set can have just one member. This set contains one item or one element, and that is LeBron James, 4-time NBA champion. A set with just one member is called a singleton set. One important thing to notice is that this set, this singleton set, is not the same as LeBron James. LeBron James is a 4-time NBA champion. This set, the singleton set containing LeBron James, is a 0-time NBA champion. It has never won an NBA championship, and it has never played a game of basketball because it is a set. This rule, rule number 8, also derives from rule number 1. If we can make any set that we want, well, then we can make a set with just one item in it. Okay, we are approaching the point where one of these rules is going to generate the paradox. It's going to blow the whole thing up. Hold on, it's coming. Rule number 9. A set can have no members. This set is called the empty set. You can write it like this with just the squiggles and nothing in between, or you can signify it with this, which is like a 0 with a line through it, which means nothing. This is an empty set, the empty set, or it's called the null set. The fact that there can be such a set just derives from rule number 1, unrestricted composition. You can make any sets you want, including a set with nothing in it. But it is derived from number 2, that set identity is determined by membership, that there's only one empty set or only one null set. That one set with nothing in it, it's defined by the fact that it has nothing in it. So if you have two sets and they're both empty, they're the same set, the null set. Now things get juicy. Rule number 10. You can have sets of sets. This just follows from number 1 as well. If you can make a set out of anything that you can think of, well, you can think of sets too, can't you? Sets can have sets in them. For example, the set of all singleton sets. You'd write it like this, which reads, the set of all x's such that x is a singleton set. That is a set of all sets. It contains the set that just includes LeBron James. It contains the set that just includes the number 17. It does not contain LeBron James, because this is the set of all singleton sets, and LeBron James is not a singleton set. He's not a set at all. He's a 4-time NBA champion. Or you could have the set of all sets, the set of all x's such that x is a set. This, by the way, is how Frege and Russell answered that question from before. What are numbers? They thought, at least they thought until Russell's paradox just blew the whole thing up, they thought that the number 1 just is the set of all singleton sets, the set of all sets with one member. And the number 2 just is the set of all sets with 2 members. Now you might be thinking, I can't wrap my head around this. What does it really mean for the number 4 to just be a certain set? What does that really mean? Don't worry, no one really understands what that means. Not really. Anyway, it doesn't matter, because the whole thing is going to be blown up right now with the next rule, which is rule number 11. Sets can contain themselves. This one's weird, and it's going to give us the paradox, but that just comes from rule number 1 also. If you can think of it, you can throw it in a set. And so you can think of sets, and so you can throw sets in themselves. Consider, for example, the set of all cats. Does that set contain itself? No, because that set is not itself a cat. It's a set, and everything in it is a cat. So it does not contain itself. What about the set of all sets? The set of all x's such that x is a set. Does that set contain itself? Yes, that set contains all the sets, and it is itself one of those sets. So,
and by this extension, you would be able to define dynamic and static sets of the set of all sets. So the set of all sets that have existed or will ever exist is a static set, but the set of all sets that have been defined is a dynamic set, is in its composition changes, and therefore its identity changes as people just think of new sets, right? And dynamic sets have a different, slightly, set of rules. That being that they are defined not only by their composition, but in the logical moment in time, which is different from a real moment in time that they were defined. A logical moment in time is the point in the logic in which the identity is set. And this comes up a lot if you're, for example, programming. If you are defining a variable to be a set number, it just is that number whenever you call it. However, if you define it later, it doesn't change retroactively that x is 17, even though you made x 18 later. So the idea that x is 17, and then you can do a bunch of logic from that, and then redefine x as 18 and do new logic, is just something you can do if you were using chronological logic. And using chronological logic, set theory is not broken by Russell's paradox, as we're about to see.
Oh, it contains itself, or the set of all the things that I'm thinking about. This set doesn't usually contain itself, but right now it does, because right now I'm thinking of that set. Let's follow the pattern of thought.
The set doesn't usually contain itself, so there is some acknowledgement of dynamic sets, even in set theory, even if they haven't defined it. And I feel it is necessary in naive set theory to define it in order to deal with this paradox. And of course, I am not a strict axiomatic mathematician. I have not taken classes on set theory. I am a programmer, a business owner, and a former nuclear reactor operator. It's just the way it is.
Russell was following in 1901 and 1902 when he discovered this paradox. He was just thinking about and developing.
So someone else will have to come fill in the gaps and figure out how to cite a vertical YouTube video if they want to cite me. I don't even care if they do. I just want the knowledge out there.
Developing this idea, rule number 11, that sets can contain themselves. Think about all the sets that do not contain themselves. The singleton set with just LeBron James. Does it contain itself? No, because it just has one thing in there, and that's LeBron. Not any sets, let alone itself. The set of all cats doesn't contain itself, because it itself is a set, not a cat. The set of all singleton sets, does that set contain itself? No, because there are a lot of singleton sets. And so the set of all singleton sets has a lot of sets in it. And so it is itself not a singleton set. It's got many, many members, many, many items in it. And so it doesn't contain itself. And then here are some sets that...
And that's actually a funny thing that comes up. If you're using a dynamic definition of the set of all singleton sets, you do not, unless you have previously defined in the dynamic logic other sets. It starts out as a null set if you define it first. If you have defined one singleton set, it contains itself. And then if you ever redefine it again at that moment, it contains the previous version of itself that was a singleton set when you defined it logically. And it will, anytime you define it later, contain that previous version of itself. And whether or not, for the set of all sets that do not contain themselves, which is the object of Russell's paradox, it is still a debate I am personally having on whether or not those are different sets. But if sets are defined by composition, then yes. In fact, if you are defining a set dynamically, no set can contain itself, because it only can contain previous versions of itself. Now, the definition of the set of all sets is inherently both defining itself as a set and therefore it would be contained in the set if you're trying to use normal logic. But if you are using chronological logic for dynamic sets, then no. It initially does not contain itself until you redefine it again later and look at the list of sets you've previously defined. Because dynamic set theory, or dynamic chronological logic, requires that you only look at what you have previously defined and built off of. And if you are building off of all sets that have been defined in mathematical papers, you can absolutely build off of that, and the set of all sets is there. But it also would therefore contain every set of all sets that has previously been defined along the line, except itself. Now, there are ways to try to work around this, but you bring back the paradox if you try to define it statically and simultaneously put the set inside of itself and define the set. You can't do those two actions at once if you are doing chronological definitions of sets.
Sets that do contain themselves. The set of all sets, that contains itself. The set of all non-singleton sets, yeah, that set contains itself because there are many non-singleton sets. And so that set, the set of all non-singleton sets, has many members, and so it's a non-singleton set. So because that set meets its own condition, it is inside of itself. Or the set of all sets that have been mentioned in this room which is an endless black abyss from which I am speaking to you right now. Up until right now, that set did not include itself, but I just mentioned it, so now it does. Here's the next thought that Russell had in England in 19...
And that's a thing. There is an acknowledgement inherently that sets can change with time. I don't understand why there isn't a discussion of this idea in this video and why it doesn't just refute it.
1901. Okay, let's take all those sets that do contain themselves, let's collect all of them together and make another set out of them, the set of sets that contain themselves. Now we've got a set of those. We'd write it like this: the set of all x's such that x is a set that contains itself. Now let's take all of the sets that do not contain themselves, collect them together, make a set out of those. Russell thinks to himself in 1901 as he's barreling toward a paradox that's going to blow up the whole project to form the foundation of mathematics and all of science. This set that includes all of those is the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. And we'd write that like this: the set of all x's such that x is a set that does not contain itself. And then something happened. He realized a problem, and he wrote this problem in a letter in 1902 on June 16th to Frege, and Frege received the letter.
And the truth is, initially when you define that set, if you are defining it chronologically, because it cannot be defined statically, as will be explained by the video, here's what happens. Actually, I will let the finish of the logic play out, and then explain. Because I think that will be more useful if you already have the idea of why it can't be defined statically. Because there are sets that cannot be defined statically.
This is what the letter really looked like. Frege got the letter, and it broke him physically. He had a breakdown and had to be hospitalized upon reading this 2-page letter. And the letter asked this question: the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. This set, does it contain itself? Here it is again. The set of all x's, the set of all things, such that x is a set that does not contain itself. Does this set contain itself? Well, let's go through both possibilities. If it does, then this set is in here, it's in itself. And the only way to be in there is to meet this condition, the condition of not containing oneself. So if this set does contain itself, well, then it meets this condition, and this condition says that it doesn't contain itself. If it does contain itself, then it doesn't. And consider the alternative possibility. If it doesn't contain itself, then it meets the condition. It's a set that doesn't contain itself. So if it doesn't contain itself, it meets the condition, and then it's in there, which means it contains itself. So if this set doesn't contain itself, then it does contain itself. If it doesn't, then it does. And if it does, then it doesn't. So this set both contains itself and doesn't contain itself.
So, real quick, you can define a theory of set theory that only includes dynamically, chronologically defined sets. And you therefore say that a static set is one that, no matter how many times you define it, the composition stays the same or reaches an equilibrium. So, for example, if you're doing the set of all sets that contain themselves and you define it initially, it chronologically only can contain sets that have been previously defined, and therefore it doesn't currently contain itself. And if you're defining it chronologically, it therefore never contains itself, because you only can include things from previous points. So the set of all sets that contain themselves doesn't contain itself chronologically. But if you define it statically, where you're including the set of all sets if you're defining it statically, you choose whether or not you put it in the set, if that makes sense. So if you put it in the set, it is true, and if you don't put it in the set, it is also true. And you can define it both ways. Now, dynamic sets are useful in the fact that they always have a strict definition, and that definition can be called upon in the logic later. But a static set is useful in the fact that you do not have to worry about some piece of the logic breaking because you're only looking up. If you're writing out a paper, you're only looking backwards in time. Now, that means, now that we have the thing defined, that the set of all sets that do not contain themselves will always contain every previous version of itself, and that will be strictly defined as a different set. Funny enough. So if you are defining it chronologically, it starts out not containing itself because it can't. It hasn't been defined yet when you define it. And therefore, you just have the set of all sets that you've defined so far that do not contain themselves. And then, when you define it again later, the set of all sets that do not contain itself, well, that one doesn't contain itself, so you put it in. But the thing is that that set is now, since it's defined by composition, not exactly the same set. So if you ever define the set of all sets that do not contain themselves again, it then becomes a new set due to composition, and it still will not contain itself because it is a different set via composition, no matter how many times you define it. And that is the beauty of this line of reasoning. It means you have to care about logical time, as in, your logic must follow a strict order. And that logic itself it comes to a different set of paradigms than a typical set of logic will. So my roommate and I had a discussion about this when he was taking a logic class. That you cannot have a contradiction of logic, and if you do, then you've proven the logic false. Well, no, redefining a set later, or redefining a thing later to include new information is not a contradiction, it's just a chronological flow. As long as it itself does not contradict itself when you define it, it doesn't matter if it changes later. That was valid then, and then if you're worried about the validity now, you have to redefine it in order to use it now, which means you then have to redefine all your sets. And there are some you can define simultaneously as long as they don't affect each other. In fact, if you are defining sets simultaneously, then the only rule is that they cannot contain each other because they didn't previously exist, right? So that's the idea. I had to very much sit down and make sure that I could get everything in. It's a half-hour deep dive in the way my train of logic worked, and I hope that makes way more sense than the 5-minute or 3-minute, whatever it was, rant that I tried to explain everything really quickly in last time. Again, shout out to Jeffrey Kaplan for his wonderful video. It goes on to explain something called predication, where predication has the same logical issue, and then again, predication itself is also fixed as long as you define things chronologically with dynamic sets. Anyways, thank you. I hope you have a wonderful day, and bye for now.